There are events in history so profoundly unsettling that they challenge our modern understanding of the past. They are not merely acts of war or political betrayal, but moments where the machinery of power grinds down a single human life with such calculated indifference that the spectacle becomes almost surreal. We are about to delve into one such story, a narrative that unfolds not on a battlefield, but within the gilded, suffocating confines of royal courts. It is the story of a girl whose name is often a footnote, a pawn in a game played by kings and dukes. But to see her only as a pawn is to miss the terrifying reality of her existence. We must ask not only what was done to her, but what it felt like to be her, a child of 6, crowned a queen, married to a grown man, and set adrift in a foreign land, all for a peace that would never last. This is the almost forgotten tragedy of Isabel of France, the child bride of a doomed English king, and her story reveals a truth far more disturbing than any simple political chronicle. It is a story about the absolute consumption of a life by the state and the slow, quiet horror of a childhood that never was. To comprehend the bizarre destiny awaiting the infant princess, one must first descend into the feverish, unstable world of late 14th century France. The nation was a fractured kingdom, haunted by the specter of the seemingly endless Hundred Years' War with England and, more insidiously, by the collapsing mind of its own monarch. King Charles VI, known to history as the Mad, was not a consistently tyrannical or incompetent ruler. His affliction was far more terrifying in its unpredictability. He suffered from recurring bouts of psychosis, episodes that could transform the ruler of France into a man who believed he was made of glass, liable to shatter at the slightest touch. During these periods, he would fail to recognize his own wife and children, run howling through the corridors of his palaces, and fall into deep, unresponsive depressions. The French court became a place of whispered anxieties and desperate remedies, where physicians and charlatans alike tried and failed to restore the king's sanity. This royal madness created a vacuum of power, a festering void into which the ambitions of the kingdom's great nobles rushed like a ravenous tide. At the center of this political vortex was Isabel's mother, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. A woman of formidable ambition and questionable loyalties, Isabeau navigated the treacherous court with a survivor's instinct. While her husband drifted in his private world of delusion, she asserted her influence, aligning herself with powerful factions to protect her own position and the future of her children. Her court was one of lavish excess, a stark and often criticized contrast to the suffering of the French populace. But this display of wealth was also a projection of power, a necessary armor in an environment where weakness was fatal. It was into this world, a world of paternal insanity, maternal calculation, and relentless political strife, that Isabel of France was born in November of 1389. She was a daughter of the House of Valois, a princess of the blood, but from the moment of her birth, her individual identity was secondary to her dynastic value. Her brothers were heirs, destined to rule or die trying. The daughters, however, were something else entirely. They were diplomatic currency, precious assets to be traded for alliances, treaties, and the fragile promise of peace. Across the English Channel, another kingdom was grappling with its own internal turmoil. England was ruled by Richard II, a king as complex and ultimately as tragic as his French counterpart. Richard had ascended to the throne as a boy of 10 and had survived the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 with a show of astonishing bravery. Yet, the man he grew into was a study in contradictions. He possessed a deep appreciation for art, culture, and the trappings of majesty, cultivating a court that was a beacon of refinement. He also harbored a powerful belief in the absolute, divine right of kings, an idea that put him on a collision course with his powerful and belligerent nobility, chief among them the group known as the Lords Appellant, which included his own uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, and his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, son of the mighty John of Gaunt. These men had humiliated Richard years earlier, executing his favorites and effectively seizing control of the government. Though Richard had since regained his authority, the memory of this affront festered, fueling a deep-seated paranoia and a burning desire for both revenge and unassailable power. Richard's first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had been a beloved companion, and her death from plague in 1394 plunged him into a profound and demonstrative grief so intense that he ordered the palace in which she died to be razed to the ground. But the grief of a king is a political liability. He needed an heir, and he needed stability. The endless, costly war with France drained his treasury and empowered the very military aristocrats he so deeply distrusted. A lasting peace, he reasoned, would not only bring prosperity to his kingdom, but would also neuter his domestic enemies, whose power and prestige were built on martial glory. A French marriage was the traditional and most potent key to such a peace. It would bind the two warring houses together, creating a personal and political union that mere treaties could not. The problem was the available French princesses. The most suitable candidate in terms of status was the eldest daughter of Charles VI, Isabel. There was, however, a significant and, to modern eyes, horrifying complication. She was a child of barely 6 years old. For a king like Richard, approaching 30 and in desperate need of a male heir, marrying a toddler was a deeply impractical long-term strategy. It would mean a wait of at least a decade before the marriage could be consummated and any hope of children could be entertained. Yet, the proposition held a unique appeal for him. The sheer unsuitability of the match on a personal level underscored its purely political nature. This was not a marriage of passion or even procreation. It was a grand gesture of peacemaking, a symbol of a new era. Furthermore, a child bride posed no immediate threat. She would bring no foreign entourage of ambitious kinsmen, no preconceived political notions. She would be a blank slate, a creature he could shape and educate within his own court, molding her into the perfect English queen. For Richard, a man obsessed with control and the ceremonial aspects of kingship, the idea of raising his own queen, of being her protector and tutor, was perhaps more appealing than a union with a mature foreign princess who might challenge his authority. And so, the grotesque logic of medieval diplomacy prevailed over common sense and human decency. The negotiations began. The French court, led by the pragmatic Duke of Burgundy, who effectively ruled during the king's incapacities, saw immense value in the match. A long-term truce with England would allow France to heal its internal divisions and recover from decades of warfare. The English envoys were dispatched to Paris in 1395 to formally request the princess's hand. What followed was a carefully choreographed piece of political theater. The English delegation was granted an audience with the 6-year-old Isabel. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, who provides one of the most vivid accounts of these events, the child was coached extensively by her governess on how to behave. She was told to present herself as a queen, to carry herself with a dignity far beyond her years. The Earl Marshal of England, Thomas de Mowbray, knelt before her, addressing her with the formal gravity one would use for a mature monarch. He spoke of the great love his king, Richard, already felt for her, a fiction so transparent it bordered on the absurd. Isabel, a small child dressed in the heavy, formal attire of a princess, reportedly responded with a composure that stunned the onlookers. She replied in a clear voice, "Sir, if it please God, and my lord and father, that I shall be Queen of England, I shall be well pleased thereat, for it is told me that I shall then be a great lady." Her performance was flawless. The English lords were charmed, reporting back to Richard that she was a beautiful and promising child who would surely grow into a worthy queen. Whether she was a preternaturally intelligent child, a brilliantly coached performer, or simply a little girl repeating memorized lines with no comprehension of their staggering meaning, is impossible to know. What is certain is that her fate was sealed in that moment. She had passed her audition. The negotiations moved forward, culminating in a proxy marriage in Paris. The Earl Marshal stood in for King Richard, a grown man taking vows on behalf of his king to a child who likely viewed the entire solemn ceremony as a confusing and elaborate game. The dowry was settled, The terms of the truce were agreed upon, and preparations began for Isabel's transfer to her new life. The handover of a royal bride was one of the great spectacles of the medieval age, a breathtaking display of wealth, power, and political symbolism. In the autumn of 1396, two immense, glittering processions set out, one from France and one from England, destined to meet near Calais. Isabel's cortege was a river of silk, velvet, and gold. She was accompanied by her father, King Charles VI, who was, mercifully, in a period of lucidity. With him came the highest nobility of France, dukes, counts, and bishops, their banners and pennants creating a forest of color. Isabel herself traveled in a lavish litter, surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting, a small, precious jewel in an overwhelming setting. The journey was a slow, majestic progress, a final tour of the homeland she would not see again for many years. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, her family, her language, her home, for a future that was utterly unknowable. The English procession was no less magnificent. King Richard II, a monarch who adored pageantry, ensured his retinue would match the French in splendor. They arrived and set up a city of luxurious tents on the field where the two parties would meet. When the day came, the two kings, longtime adversaries, met and embraced, a symbolic act meant to wash away decades of bloodshed. Then came the central moment of the entire affair, the formal presentation of the bride. King Charles took his daughter by the hand and led her to Richard. Froissart describes the scene with poignant detail. Richard, the tall, elegant English king, looked down upon the tiny figure before him. Isabel, who had been crying at the prospect of leaving her father, was now presented to this stranger who was her husband. Richard, seeing her distress, spoke to her gently, assuring her that he would be a good and kind father to her, promising that she would be a great lady and queen of England. His words were likely meant to be comforting, but they only served to underscore the fundamental strangeness of their union. He was not just her husband. He was now her de facto guardian, the ultimate authority in her life. The formal marriage ceremony took place shortly after in the Church of St. Nicholas in Calais. Isabel, not yet 7 years old, stood at the altar beside Richard, who was 29. The disparity in their ages and statures must have been a jarring sight, even for a medieval audience accustomed to political marriages. The vows were exchanged, the rings blessed. The child was now officially the Queen of England. A magnificent feast followed, a celebration of a peace treaty embodied in the form of a little girl. But beneath the veneer of celebration and diplomacy, a current of unease ran deep. The Duke of Gloucester, Richard's uncle and sworn enemy, was openly scornful of the proceedings. He saw the peace and the marriage as a betrayal of English interests, a foolish sacrifice of hard-won territories for a French alliance and a barren, child queen. His contempt was a dark omen, a harbinger of the storm that was already gathering back in England, a storm that would eventually consume not only Richard but his innocent bride as well. Upon her arrival in England, Isabel was treated with all the formal deference due to a queen. She was taken to London, where the citizens put on a lavish display of welcome, with pageants and processions lining the streets. But it was a welcome for a symbol, not a person. She was then crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey in a ceremony of immense solemnity and splendor. The heavy crown of St. Edward was held over her small head, too heavy for her to actually wear, and she was anointed with holy oil, a child consecrated to a role she could not possibly comprehend. Following the coronation, she was established in her own household at Windsor Castle, a magnificent fortress that must have seemed both wondrous and terrifyingly vast to a 7-year-old. Her life became a carefully managed routine, a gilded imprisonment dictated by protocol. King Richard, to his credit, seems to have been unfailingly kind and considerate towards his child wife. He visited her regularly, not as a husband, but as a concerned guardian. Chroniclers report that he would sit with her, talk to her, and bring her gifts. Their interactions were gentle, paternalistic encounters, a far cry from the brutalities one might fear. Richard appears to have taken his role as her protector seriously, ensuring she was comfortable and well cared for. He appointed esteemed ladies to her household and saw to her education. She learned to speak English, to play musical instruments, and to conduct herself with the grace expected of a queen. In this strange, suspended reality, a genuine affection seems to have developed between the lonely, embattled king and the isolated child queen. For Isabel, he was the center of her new universe, the only familiar and constant presence in a world of foreign faces and strange customs. For Richard, she was perhaps a symbol of the peace he craved, an embodiment of an innocence and purity that was so absent from the cynical world of politics he inhabited. Yet, the tranquility of Isabel's life at Windsor was a fragile illusion. While she played in the castle gardens, the political landscape of England was cracking under the strain of Richard's increasingly autocratic rule. In 1397, feeling secure in his French alliance, Richard finally moved against the men who had humiliated him a decade earlier. He struck with stunning speed and ruthlessness. The Duke of Gloucester, the most vocal critic of his French policy, was arrested, shipped to Calais, and secretly murdered, almost certainly on the king's orders. The Earls of Warwick and Arundel were also arrested. Arundel was executed, and Warwick was exiled. This act of royal vengeance sent a shockwave of terror through the English aristocracy. Richard had shown his teeth, and his nobles now understood that he was a king who would not tolerate dissent. He was becoming a tyrant in their eyes, ruling by fear and decree rather than by consensus. The final act of Richard's self-destruction involved the two remaining members of the Lords Appellant, his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, and Thomas de Mowbray, the very man who had acted as his proxy at Isabel's betrothal. When the two men had a public falling out, Richard intervened, not as a dispenser of justice, but as an opportunist. He banished them both from the kingdom, Mowbray for life, and Bolingbroke for a term of years. It was a clever move to remove two powerful potential threats. But he then made a fatal error. In 1399, while Bolingbroke was in exile, his father, the immensely powerful and wealthy John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, died. In a move of staggering greed and political folly, Richard confiscated the entire Lancastrian inheritance, dispossessing his own cousin and violating the fundamental principles of aristocratic property rights. This was the tipping point. Richard had not just angered a single man. He had terrified every landowner in England. If the king could arbitrarily seize the vast estates of the Duchy of Lancaster, then no one's property was safe. He had alienated his nobility, the very foundation of his power, beyond repair. It was in this atmosphere of simmering rebellion that Richard made his second fatal mistake. Confident that his kingdom was subdued, he departed for Ireland to quell a rebellion there. He left the kingdom in the care of his aging uncle, the Duke of York, a well-meaning but ineffectual regent. The king's absence provided the perfect opportunity for his enemies. Henry Bolingbroke, now a disinherited and vengeful man with a legitimate grievance, saw his moment. He broke his exile and landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, claiming initially that he had only returned to reclaim his rightful inheritance as Duke of Lancaster. He was a charismatic and politically astute figure, and discontented nobles flocked to his banner. The trickle of support quickly became a flood. The campaign to reclaim his duchy rapidly transformed into a campaign for the crown itself. For the 9-year-old Queen Isabel, these earth-shattering events unfolded at a terrifying distance. She had been moved from Windsor to Wallingford Castle for her safety, but she was completely isolated from the political storm. News would have arrived in confusing, fragmented reports. The king was in Ireland. An army was gathering in the north. The regent, the Duke of York, had abandoned the royalist cause and joined Bolingbroke. Her world, so carefully constructed by Richard, was beginning to crumble. The trusted faces in her household grew anxious, their whispers filling the stone corridors with a dread she could feel but not fully understand. Her husband, the king, the center of her existence, was away, and in his place, a shadow was falling over England. Richard, hearing of Bolingbroke's invasion, rushed back from Ireland, but it was too late. His support had evaporated. His army deserted him. He was cornered, outmaneuvered, and ultimately forced to surrender to his cousin at Flint Castle in Wales. He was taken as a prisoner to London, where he was made to endure the humiliation of a public procession, jeered by the same crowds that had once cheered him. Bolingbroke's victory was total. The next, she was the wife of a deposed traitor, a prisoner of the man who had stolen her husband's crown. Her household was broken up. Her loyal French attendants were dismissed and sent back to France, leaving her utterly alone among her enemies. She was placed under house arrest, first at Sonning, a residence of the Bishop of Salisbury, and then moved from castle to castle, a valuable pawn in the new king's hands. The new regime, anxious to legitimize its rule, sought to control the narrative. They attempted to tell Isabel that her husband had willingly abdicated and had gone to live a comfortable private life. But even at 10 years old, Isabel possessed a fierce loyalty and a spirit that could not be easily broken. The chroniclers record her reaction. She refused to believe them, wept inconsolably, and declared her unwavering devotion to her husband, King Richard. Her grief and defiance were a political embarrassment for the new king. The fate of the deposed Richard II is one of history's enduring mysteries. The official story, put out by Henry IV government, was that he died of starvation at Pontefract Castle in February of 1400, having willfully refused food and water out of despair. This convenient narrative was widely disbelieved, both at the time and by later historians. It is far more likely that he was murdered on Henry's orders, probably by forced starvation or suffocation, to eliminate the dangerous possibility of a royalist rebellion rallying around him. His death, whether by murder or neglect, was the brutal and inevitable final act of the usurpation. The news was delivered to his child widow. At the age of 10, Isabel of France was a queen no more. She was the widow of a man branded a tyrant, and she was alone, a captive in a hostile kingdom that had once been hers to rule. Her status was now dangerously ambiguous. She was the Dowager Queen of England, but also the daughter of the King of France, a potential rallying point for remaining Ricardian loyalists, and a valuable diplomatic bargaining chip. Henry IV was in a delicate position. He could not simply discard her, as that would provoke the French and invalidate the peace treaty. He also could not allow her to become a symbol of opposition. His proposed solution was as cynical as it was audacious. He suggested that Isabel should be married to his own son and heir, the young Prince of Wales, the future Henry V. From Henry's perspective, this was a masterstroke. It would seamlessly transfer her royal status to the new Lancastrian dynasty, solidify the French alliance, and neutralize her as a political threat. For Isabel, the proposition was a grotesque horror. It would mean marrying the son of the man who had deposed and, in all likelihood, murdered her beloved husband and protector. For months, Henry IV's counselors tried to persuade her. They used gentle reasoning, veiled threats, and promises of a glittering future as the next Queen of England. But the 10-year-old girl remained implacable. Her loyalty to Richard, even in death, was absolute. She consistently and courageously refused the match. Her defiance, the defiance of a powerless child, became a significant diplomatic obstacle for the new king. She would not be his daughter-in-law. She would not legitimize his usurpation with her consent. Her stubborn refusal infuriated Henry, but also forced his hand. He could not keep her in England indefinitely as a reluctant guest who was, in effect, a prisoner. The French court, now fully aware of the coup and Richard's death, began to demand her immediate return, along with the full repayment of her enormous dowry. What followed was a protracted and humiliating period of negotiation. Henry IV, whose own treasury was far from secure, had no intention of returning the full dowry, which had already been spent. He haggled and delayed, treating the young dowager queen less like a royal princess and more like a seized asset to be liquidated. For over a year, Isabel remained in a state of limbo, moved between royal residences, her future debated by men in council chambers hundreds of miles away. Finally, in 1401, an agreement was reached. Isabel would be sent back to France, but only a fraction of her dowry would be returned. In a final act of avarice and spite, Henry's agents stripped her of the magnificent jewels and plate that had been part of her trousseau and wedding gifts. She was to be returned not as a queen, but as a diminished figure, a symbol of a broken treaty and a failed peace. Her journey back to France was the somber inverse of her magnificent arrival 5 years earlier. There was no pageantry, no cheering crowds. It was a quiet, melancholy procession. She was handed over to the French ambassadors, and as she set foot once more on French soil, she was no longer Queen of England. She was simply Isabel of Valois again, a widow at 11 years old, her brief, strange reign over. Her return to the French court was a bittersweet affair. She was welcomed back by her family, but her presence was a constant, living reminder of a failed diplomatic gamble. The court she returned to was even more dangerously fractured than the one she had left. Her father's madness was worsening, and the rivalry between the factions led by the Duke of Burgundy and her own uncle, Louis, Duke of Orleans, was escalating towards open civil war. Isabel, with her English past and her potential claims, was once again a piece in a complex and deadly game. For several years, Isabel lived in a state of quiet obscurity, her future uncertain. She had been a queen, and her status meant she could not simply be married off to a minor noble. A suitable match had to be found, one that would serve the interests of the French crown and the powerful Orleans faction to which her mother now adhered. The chosen candidate was her own cousin, Charles, the young son and heir of the Duke of Orleans. Charles was a cultured and poetic young man, known more for his literary talents than his martial prowess. The match was politically advantageous, cementing the alliance between Queen Isabeau and the House of Orleans. For Isabel, now a teenager, it offered something more, the prospect of a genuine, companionate marriage. They were wed in 1406. She was 16, he was 11. Despite the age difference, a true and deep affection blossomed between them. This period represents the only time in Isabel's life where she seems to have found a measure of personal happiness and stability. With Charles, she experienced a partnership free from the bizarre power dynamics and political pressures of her first marriage. They shared a love of poetry, music, and the refined courtly life. She was no longer a pawn in a grand international treaty, but a duchess, the wife of a man who genuinely cared for her. She became pregnant, and it seemed, for a brief, hopeful moment, that the tragedies of her past were behind her. She was finally on the cusp of the life a royal woman was supposed to have, a loving husband, a secure position, and the promise of a family. But fate had one more cruel blow to deliver. In 1407, her father-in-law, Louis of Orleans, was brutally assassinated in the streets of Paris on the orders of his rival, the Duke of Burgundy. This act plunged France into the destructive Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. Her young husband, Charles, was now the Duke of Orleans and the leader of a blood-soaked political faction, thrust into a world of violence and vengeance for which he was ill-suited. The brief interlude of peace was shattered forever. Charles was now a key player in a brutal internal conflict, and Isabel's life was once again overshadowed by political strife. The war raged on, a bloody backdrop to her domestic life. Then, in 1409, Isabel went into labor. She gave birth to a daughter, Joan. The delivery was difficult, and Isabel, weakened by the ordeal, failed to recover. On the 13th of September, 1409, at the Château de Blois, Isabel of France, former Queen of England and now Duchess of Orleans, died from complications of childbirth. She was just 19 years old. Her life, which had begun with such spectacular pomp and been defined by such extraordinary political pressures, ended quietly, in a manner tragically common for women of her era. The final, bitter irony of her story would play out years after her death. Her husband, Charles of Orleans, would lead the French army at the catastrophic Battle of Agincourt in 1415 against the very man who had once been proposed as her second English husband, King Henry V. Charles was captured on the battlefield and would spend the next 25 years as a prisoner in England, composing some of the most beautiful and melancholy poetry of the Middle Ages. The daughter Isabel died giving birth to Joan, would go on to marry the Duke of Alsace and become a staunch ally of another iconic French figure. Joan of Arc, Isabel's legacy, therefore, is woven into the very fabric of the ongoing conflict she was supposed to have ended. So what are we to make of this short, tragic life? Isabel of France stands as a heartbreaking monument to the brutal intersection of statecraft and childhood. She was, from her first breath to her last, an object, a commodity whose personal feelings and well-being were entirely subordinate to the political needs of men. Her story forces us to look past the heraldry and the chronicles of kings and to see the profound human cost of dynastic ambition. Was she merely an unlucky pawn, or was she a victim of a system that viewed royal children, particularly daughters, as little more than sentient property? The answer seems painfully clear. Her brief moments of defiance, her refusal to believe Richard was gone, her rejection of Henry IV's son, shine through the historical record as small acts of incredible courage, the desperate assertions of a personal will in a life that was never her own. The tale of the Child Queen is not a romance. It is a horror story dressed in silk and gold. It reveals the cold, transactional heart of medieval power, where a 6-year-old girl could be crowned, married, widowed, and held captive before she even reached adolescence. Her life was a sacrifice laid on the altar of a fragile peace, a peace that crumbled to dust almost immediately. She is a ghost who haunts the margins of a famous historical drama, a quiet, tragic figure whose suffering puts the grand ambitions of kings and the violent birth of dynasties into a chilling and deeply human perspective. Her story is a necessary reminder that behind the great tapestries of history, with their depictions of battles and coronations, there are always individual threads, individual lives, often torn and broken by the very events we are taught to remember as glorious.